Hey guys, tonight we're stepping away from the familiar darkness of our own backyards and traveling across the world to a place where the sun is bright, the beaches are golden, and the mysteries are just as deep and unsettling. We're not just looking at a crime, but at a single, perfect, and utterly baffling enigma. A puzzle left on a sandy shore that has perplexed a nation for over 70 years. This is a story from the dawn of the Cold War, a time of whispered secrets, coded messages, and a global atmosphere of suspicion. It's an age of spies and shadows, where a person's identity could be as disposable as a burned match. And the monster we're looking for isn't a frenzied killer, but a ghost. A man who was, in every sense of the word, a complete and total unknown. So before you settle in, maybe take a moment to appreciate the things that make you, your name, your history, the people who know you. Because tonight we're telling the story of a man who had none of that. This isn't just a whodunit. It's a who was he. It's a case that feels less like a police file and more like a spy novel written by a ghost. So take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready for a mystery that will get under your skin and stay there. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always a little comforting to know we're all pondering these strange shadows together. Now dim the lights. Forget the hum of the world outside. Tonight, we're walking along a quiet Australian beach at sunset. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Taman Shud case, the Somerton man. Our story begins on the morning of December 1st, 1948, on Somerton Beach, a quiet, pleasant stretch of sand just outside Adelaide, South Australia. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow on the water. A man out for a morning stroll with his horse noticed something odd. Lying on the sand, propped up against the seawall, was another man. He was dressed impeccably in a suit, tie, and polished shoes. His head was resting against the wall. His legs were crossed, and an unlit cigarette was resting on his collar, as if it had fallen from his lips as he drifted off to sleep. At first glance, it looked as though the man was simply sleeping off a long night. It wasn't an entirely uncommon sight. But as the morning wore on and the man didn't move, another passerby took a closer look. The man was not sleeping. He was dead. The police were called, and from the very beginning, they knew this was no ordinary case. There was no sign of a struggle, no visible wounds, no indication of violence whatsoever. The man's pockets contained a few seemingly random items: an unused train ticket to a nearby suburb, a bus ticket, a pack of chewing gum, a comb, and a pack of Army Club cigarettes, which contained a few cigarettes of another, more expensive brand called Kensitas. But there was no wallet, no money, and most importantly, no identification of any kind. This man, dressed so neatly, so respectably, was a complete blank. His clothing offered no clues either. All of the labels and tags had been meticulously cut out. The suit, the shirt, the tie, every single piece of identifying information had been removed. This was not a man who had been robbed. This was a man who had been deliberately and systematically erased. The coroner's examination only deepened the mystery. The man was in peak physical condition, estimated to be in his early 40s. His hands were soft and clean, showing no signs of manual labor. His calf muscles were unusually well developed, like those of a dancer or a long-distance runner. The autopsy could find no clear cause of death. There were no signs of poison, no internal injuries. The only abnormalities were a spleen that was 3 times its normal size and a liver congested with blood, signs that were consistent with poisoning. But the toxicology reports came back empty. The official cause of death was listed as unknown, though poisoning was strongly suspected. A fast-acting, untraceable poison that left no evidence behind. The police were faced with a profound puzzle. They had a dead man, but no name, no cause of death, and no idea how he had ended up on Somerton Beach. They took his fingerprints and circulated them throughout Australia and then to the rest of the English-speaking world. No matches were found. They published his photograph in newspapers across the country. "Who is this man?" the headlines pleaded. Hundreds of people came forward with theories and supposed identifications, but each one was a dead end. The man on the beach remained a phantom. He became known simply as the Somerton Man. The investigation was at a standstill for months. The man's body was embalmed and a plaster cast was made of his head and shoulders, preserving his features in the hope that he might one day be identified. He was a man with a face but no name, a story with a final chapter but no beginning. Then, in April of 1949, 4 months after the body was found, a breakthrough came from an unlikely place. The chief pathologist, who had re-examined the man's clothing, discovered a tiny, hidden pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers. Tucked inside this secret fob pocket was a small, tightly rolled-up scrap of paper. On the paper were two printed words, Taman Shud. The phrase was quickly identified by librarians at the local public library. It was Persian, and it meant "it is ended" or "it is finished." The words were the final phrase from a famous collection of poems called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book of 11th century Persian poetry that deals with themes of life, love, death, and the importance of living for the moment, as the end is always near. The phrase Taman Shud was literally the last page of the book. This was a bizarre and incredibly literary clue. The police now believed that the scrap of paper had been torn from a specific copy of the Rubaiyat. They launched a nationwide search, appealing to the public to find the book from which this tiny scrap had been torn. The story of the Somerton man and his cryptic final message captivated the nation. It felt like something out of a detective novel. The search for the book proved fruitless for a time. But then, a local man came forward with a story. He told police that shortly after the man's body was found, he had discovered a rare, first-edition copy of the Rubaiyat that had been tossed into the back of his unlocked car, which he had parked near Somerton Beach on the night of the death. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after seeing the police appeal in the newspaper, he realized its significance. He handed the book over to the police. When they examined it, they found that the final page, containing the words Taman Shud, had been torn out. The paper, the typeface, and the texture matched the scrap found in the Somerton man's pocket perfectly. This was the book. But the book contained more than just a missing page. On its back cover, written faintly in pencil, were 5 lines of what appeared to be a code. The letters were arranged in a seemingly random sequence. Rgobabt Mliawi Tbimpinit Mliaboayak Itn Samskab. The code was unlike any known military or commercial cipher of the time. It was sent to naval intelligence and to the country's top cryptographers. To this day, it has never been definitively solved. It remains one of the most baffling and tantalizing pieces of the puzzle. What secret message did the Somerton man, or his killer, leave behind in the back of this poetry book? The book also contained one more clue, one that seemed, for a moment, like it might finally blow the case wide open. Written on the inside back cover was a telephone number. It was an unlisted number belonging to a young woman who lived just a few hundred yards from where the Somerton man's body had been found. She was a nurse. Her name was Jessica Thompson, though at the time, she was known to the police by her nickname, Jestin. When the police tracked her down and showed her the plaster cast of the Somerton man's face, her reaction was described as completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. She seemed shocked, horrified even, but she denied ever knowing the man. She claimed she had no idea who he was, or why her phone number would be in his book. She did admit, however, to one strange connection. She told police that at one point, she had owned a copy of the Rubaiyat. She had given it as a gift to a man she had known during World War II, an army lieutenant named Alfred Boxall. For the investigators, this was a lightning bolt. Alfred Boxall. Was this their man? Had they finally found a name for the phantom on the beach? They immediately launched a search for Boxall, believing he was the Somerton man. But when they found him, living and well in Sydney, he presented them with his own copy of the Rubaiyat, the one Jessica Jestin Thompson had given him years earlier, and on its final page, the words Taman Shud were still perfectly intact. Alfred Boxall was not the Somerton man. The lead had turned into another baffling dead end. But the connection to Jessica Thompson remained a powerful and suspicious one. Why was her phone number in the book? Why did she have such an extreme reaction to seeing the man's face? And why, when she was questioned, did she seem so evasive, so guarded? She told police she was afraid her name would be linked to the case and that it would cause a scandal with her husband. The police, respecting the social conventions of the time, agreed to keep her identity a secret, and her name was not publicly revealed for decades. But for many investigators, both then and now, Jessica Thompson is the key. She is the one person who seems to be directly and inexplicably linked to the dead man and the book containing his final message. Did she know more than she was letting on? Was she protecting someone? Or was she, too, a victim in this strange and silent drama? The case was now a web of intersecting mysteries. A dead man with no name, a book of poetry with a torn-out phrase meaning, "It is finished," a secret, unbreakable code, and a mysterious nurse who lived just down the street and seemed to hold the key, but refused to turn it. The Somerton man was no longer just an unidentified body. He was the central figure in a real-life spy thriller, a story of secrets, codes, and a beautiful, enigmatic woman. The question was, what was the secret that was so important it was worth dying for? The Cold War was in full swing, and the quiet suburbs of Adelaide were beginning to feel like a very dangerous place. The discovery of Jessica Jeston Thompson and her connection to the Rebate should have been the key that unlocked the entire mystery. Instead, it only added another layer of impenetrable fog. Her denial of knowing the Somerton man, despite her powerful emotional reaction and the presence of her phone number in the book, was a contradiction that has puzzled investigators for decades. The police, bound by the social mores of the 1940s and her request for anonymity, did not press her too aggressively. They accepted her story at face value, and the investigation moved on, leaving her as a tantalizing but ultimately untouchable piece of the puzzle. With the Alfred Boxall lead turning into a dead end, the police were back to square one. They had a body without a name, a code without a key, and a mystery without a motive. The official investigation eventually wound down, the case files growing thick with speculation but thin on facts. The Somerton man was buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery in June of 1949. The service was small. The headstone was simple, bearing the words, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach." But the mystery itself refused to be buried. It became one of Australia's most enduring obsessions, a national enigma that captured the imagination of generations. The central theory that emerged, and the one that has held the most sway over the years, is that the Somerton man was a spy. This theory fits the context of the time perfectly. In 1948, the Cold War was just beginning to heat up. Australia, as a key Western ally, was not as sleepy and isolated as it seemed. It was home to a major weapons testing facility, the Woomera Prohibited Area, located not far from Adelaide. It was also a known hub for Soviet intelligence operations. The idea that a clandestine world of espionage was operating just beneath the surface of quiet suburban life was not far-fetched at all. The details of the Somerton man case seemed to tick all the boxes of a spy novel. The untraceable poison, the meticulously removed labels from his clothing, the use of a secret pocket, the cryptic code, the book of poetry used for communication, a known espionage technique called a book code, and the beautiful, mysterious woman who lived nearby. It all points to a world of covert operations. In this scenario, the Somerton man was likely an agent, either for the Soviets or a Western power, who had been silenced. Perhaps he was a double agent who had been discovered, or a spy who was about to defect. His death was a clean, professional execution, designed to look like a natural death or a suicide, and his identity was erased to prevent any investigation into his network. The cryptic code in the back of the Rebate could have been his final, desperate message, or perhaps a key to a one-time pad cipher that died with him. Jessica Thompson, in this version of the story, could have been his handler, a fellow agent, or a honey trap designed to lure him to his death. Her denial of knowing him would have been a matter of self-preservation, a necessary lie to protect herself and her own secrets. This spy theory is compelling and fits the evidence better than almost any other. But like all the other theories, it lacks definitive proof. No government has ever acknowledged any connection to the case. No intelligence files have ever surfaced that shed light on his identity. It remains a powerful and enduring piece of speculation. Over the decades, the case has been kept alive by a dedicated community of researchers and amateur sleuths, most notably Professor Derek Abbott of the University of Adelaide. Abbott has spent years meticulously re-examining every piece of evidence, applying modern scientific and analytical techniques to the 70-year-old mystery. It was through Abbott's efforts that the story of Jessica Jestin Thompson took another turn. Her identity was finally made public after her death in 2007. Abbott managed to track down her family and interview her daughter, Kate Thompson. Kate revealed that her mother had been a complex and secretive woman. She spoke 8 languages, had an interest in communism, and had always seemed to be living with a hidden past. Most astonishingly, Kate claimed that her mother had admitted to knowing who the Somerton man was, and that his identity was known to a level higher than the police. She said her mother had told her that the case was not something she should get involved in, hinting at a dark and dangerous secret. This revelation only deepened the suspicion that Jessica Thompson was the central figure in the mystery. But the story became even more personal and complex. Professor Abbott and Kate Thompson began to speculate that the Somerton man might have been the father of Jessica's own son, Robin, who was born in 1947. The timelines fit, and Robin Thompson had some unusual physical characteristics, including the same rare ear formation as the Somerton man, a trait that is genetically inherited. Could the Somerton man have been a former lover of Jessica's, a man who came back to see her and his child, only to be silenced? This theory adds a layer of human tragedy to the spy narrative. It suggests a story of forbidden love, a secret child, and a man who was killed not just for political reasons, but for personal ones as well. The ultimate quest for both Abbott and the global community of Cooperites of the Southern Hemisphere was to give the Somerton man his name back. The key, as it was with the boy in the box, lay in DNA. For years, there was a debate about whether to exhume the Somerton man's body to obtain a genetic sample. The plaster cast of his bust contained several hairs that had fallen from his head, and these were the first hope. In 2022, after years of painstaking work, Professor Abbott, working with the renowned American genetic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, the same expert who helped identify the boy in the box, announced a major breakthrough. Using advanced techniques to analyze the DNA from the hairs preserved in the plaster cast, they had built a genealogical tree. They had traced his maternal line back through generations, and they had found a name. They identified the Somerton man as Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker born in 1905 in a suburb of Melbourne. He was not a foreigner. He was an Australian. He was a man who had a family, a wife he had separated from, and a history. The records showed he was a man with a passion for poetry and a penchant for betting on horse races. The mystery man, the international spy, the phantom on the beach, suddenly had a name, a profession, and a life. The identification of Carl Charles Webb was a monumental moment, a solution to a 74-year-old mystery. But like all great mysteries, the answer to one question only opened up a dozen more. If he was an electrical engineer from Melbourne, what was he doing in Adelaide? Why was his identity so thoroughly erased? Why did he have an untraceable poison in his system? And what was his connection to Jessica Thompson? The new information seems to both support and complicate the existing theories. As an instrument maker, Webb might have had connections to sensitive government or industrial projects, which could still support the spy theory. His love of poetry makes his use of the rubaiyat feel personal and fitting. But the core mystery of his death and the unbreakable code he left behind remains unsolved. We now know who he was, but we still don't know what happened to him. The case of the Somerton man has been transformed. It is no longer the story of a complete unknown, but the story of Carl Charles Webb, a man whose life took a turn so strange and so secret that it ended on a lonely beach, leaving behind a puzzle that would captivate the world. The final chapter of his story is still being written. Researchers continue to dig into Webb's life, searching for the events that led him to Adelaide in 1948. They are still trying to understand his relationship with Jessica Thompson and to crack the final, stubborn code. The Taman Shud case is a profound and beautiful mystery. It is a story that shows how a single, quiet death can ripple through time, creating a legend that is far grander than the life it replaced. It is a testament to the human desire to solve puzzles, to find order in chaos, and to give a name to the unknown. For 74 years, the man on Somerton Beach was a symbol of the perfect, unsolvable crime. He was a ghost, but now he is a person. We are left with the image of a man, Carl Webb, sitting on a beach at dusk, watching the sun set over the water. A man who loved poetry, who had a family, who lived a life. A man whose final act was to leave behind a message. It is finished. We may now know his name, but the meaning of his end, and the story of how he got there, is a secret that he, and perhaps a mysterious nurse named Justin, took with them to the grave. The puzzle is no longer who he was, but why his story had to be so completely and utterly erased. The Keddy Cabin Murders. The mystery of the Somerton Man was a quiet one, a puzzle of codes and whispers played out against the backdrop of the Cold War. It was a story defined by its clinical precision and its lack of visible violence. But there is another kind of darkness, one that is not quiet or precise at all. It is a darkness that is messy, brutal, and explosive. A storm of rage that descends upon a place and leaves behind a scene of almost incomprehensible chaos. For our next story, we travel from the quiet shores of Australia to the remote, pine-scented mountains of Northern California. We go to a small, rustic resort town in the early 1980s, a place that was supposed to be a peaceful getaway from the world. It is here, in a single, isolated cabin, that a family would be annihilated in an act of such savage, intimate violence that it has left a permanent scar on the community and created a mystery that is as frustrating as it is horrifying. This is not a story of a phantom who left no trace, but of a killer who left too many clues, and a crime scene that was so contaminated it became a puzzle with too many pieces. This is the story of what happened in Cabin 28. Our story begins in Keddy, California, a former railroad town nestled deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Plumas County. By 1981, Keddy was a shadow of its former self, a semi-abandoned resort town with a few dozen year-round residents. It was a place of rustic cabins, towering pine trees, and a profound sense of isolation. It was a place people went to get away, a quiet corner of the world where trouble was not supposed to find you. The Keddy Resort, the heart of the community, had seen better days, and many of its cabins were rented out to long-term residents, people living on the margins, drawn by the cheap rent and the seclusion. In the fall of 1980, a woman named Glenna Sue Sharp moved into Cabin 28 with her 5 children. Sue, 36, was a single mother who had recently left an abusive marriage in Connecticut and had come to California seeking a fresh start for her family. She was a loving mother, doing her best to raise her kids in difficult circumstances. Her children were John, 15, a thoughtful and protective older brother; Sheila, 14, a bright and popular high school student; Tina, 12, a sweet and gentle girl; and her 2 youngest sons, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5. They were a family trying to piece their lives back together in the quiet solitude of the mountains. On the evening of April 11th, 1981, the Sharp family settled in for a quiet night. Sue was at home with her 2 youngest sons, Rick and Greg, and a neighborhood friend of theirs, Justin Smart, who was staying for a sleepover. Her oldest son, John, was at a friend's house in the nearby town of Quincy with his own friend, Dana Wingate. Her daughter, Sheila, had plans to stay at a neighbor's house that night. The youngest daughter, 12-year-old Tina, was at home, but she had been spending time at a neighbor's cabin earlier in the evening, watching television. She was last seen heading back to Cabin 28 around 9:30 p.m. The next morning, Sunday, April 12th, Sheila Sharp returned home around 7:45 a.m. from her sleepover. When she opened the door to Cabin 28, she was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The living room was a bloodbath. Lying on the floor, bound with electrical wire and medical tape, were the bodies of her mother, her brother John, and John's friend, Dana Wingate. They had been brutally beaten with a claw hammer and stabbed repeatedly with a steak knife. A second knife was found at the scene, bent from the force of the attack. One of the murder weapons, a steak knife, was still impaled in Dana Wingate's body. The violence that had been unleashed in the small cabin was savage and overwhelming. In the midst of this carnage, Sheila made a discovery that was both a miracle and a mystery. In one of the bedrooms, she found her 2 younger brothers, Rick and Greg, and their friend Justin Smart, alive and physically unharmed. They had somehow slept through the entire horrific ordeal in the next room. But there was another horror to come. As the police began to process the scene, they realized that someone was missing. Sue's youngest daughter, 12-year-old Tina Sharp, was gone. There was no sign of her in the cabin, no indication of what had happened to her. She had vanished from the heart of a massacre. The investigation into the Ketty cabin murders began immediately, but it was plagued from the very beginning by a series of critical, almost unbelievable mistakes. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department was a small, rural police force, completely unequipped to handle a crime of this complexity and brutality. The crime scene, which should have been immediately sealed and preserved, was treated with a shocking lack of professionalism. Dozens of people, neighbors, police officers, resort employees, were allowed to wander in and out of Cabin 28 in the initial hours. Evidence was touched, moved, and contaminated. The initial search for clues was haphazard. One detective, in a now infamous example of the investigation's incompetence, picked up the bloody knife from the scene with his bare hands and put it in his pocket. The crime scene was, in essence, destroyed before it could ever be properly analyzed. This initial failure would haunt the case for decades, creating a fog of confusion and lost evidence from which the investigation would never fully recover. The autopsies confirmed the horrific nature of the crimes. Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate had all died from a combination of blunt force trauma and stab wounds. The attacks were so ferocious that the victims were almost unrecognizable. The killer or killers had acted with a level of rage that suggested a deeply personal motive. This was not a random act of violence. This was an explosion of hatred. The investigation quickly focused on trying to understand what could have triggered such a brutal attack. The police began to interview the residents of the small, insular Ketty community. They soon learned that Sue Sharp had recently befriended a man named Marty Smart, who lived in the neighboring Cabin 26. Marty was married to a woman named Marilyn, and they had a son, Justin, the same boy who had been in Cabin 28 on the night of the murders and had survived. Marty Smart was a troubled man with a history of violence and a volatile temper. He was also a veteran who was reportedly suffering from PTSD. According to his wife, Marilyn, Marty had developed an unhealthy interest in Sue Sharp. He was overprotective of her and had become angry and resentful when he felt she was not receptive to his counseling. Marilyn told police that on the night of the murders, Marty and a friend of his, a man named John Bubade, had been at a local bar. They had left together, and Marty had returned home late, claiming he had lost his hammer. This lead was incredibly promising. The police had a primary suspect, Marty Smart, who had a potential motive, jealousy or rage, a history of violence, and a connection to the victims. They also had a potential accomplice, Bubade, a man with a known criminal record from Chicago who was staying with Smart at the time. Bubade was rumored to have connections to organized crime. The police interviewed both Smart and Bubade. Both men denied any involvement. Smart even volunteered to take a lie detector test, which he reportedly passed. The police, perhaps swayed by the polygraph result or intimidated by Smart's aggressive personality, seemed to back off. They did not pursue the lead with the vigor it seemed to deserve. Marty Smart and Bubade, who seemed to be the most logical suspects, were largely dismissed in the early stages of the investigation. The focus of the police then shifted in a different direction. They began to suspect that the murders might be connected to the drug trade. They theorized that John Sharp and Dana Wingate might have been involved in dealing marijuana, and that they had stolen something from a dangerous dealer, leading to a violent retaliation. This theory was fueled by rumors and the discovery of a small amount of drugs in the area, but there was no concrete evidence to support it. It was a theory that led the investigation down a long and fruitless path, away from the more personal and proximate suspects who lived just next door. While the police pursued the drug angle, the mystery of the missing girl, Tina Sharp, continued to haunt the case. For 3 long years, her fate remained unknown. Her disappearance added another layer of heartbreak and mystery to the tragedy. Was she a witness who had been abducted to silence her? Or was she the primary target of the attack for some unknown reason? Then, in April of 1984, 3 years after the murders, a breakthrough came. A man who was collecting bottles in the woods near Feather Falls, a remote area about 30 miles from Keddie, discovered a human skull and a jawbone. Dental records confirmed the worst. The remains belonged to 12-year-old Tina Sharp. An anonymous phone call had been made to the sheriff's office shortly after the discovery, claiming the skull was Tina's, even before it was officially identified. The caller was never traced. The discovery of Tina's remains answered one question, but it created many more. It confirmed that she had been murdered, likely on the same night as her family, but it did not explain why she had been taken from the cabin while the 3 other children had been left alive. The location where her remains were found, so far from Keddie, suggested that the killer or killers had a vehicle and were familiar with the remote backroads of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The case was now a quadruple homicide and an abduction, but the police were no closer to finding the killer. The initial investigation had been so thoroughly botched that the trail had gone cold almost immediately. The evidence was contaminated, the primary suspects had been dismissed, and the case was mired in a fog of conflicting theories and small-town rumors. The story of the Keddie Cabin murders became a dark piece of Northern California folklore, a cautionary tale about the violence that can lurk in even the most peaceful and isolated of places. Cabin 28 was torn down in 2004, its physical presence erased, but the memory of what happened there lingered. The case remained cold for decades, a frustrating and heartbreaking puzzle with too many pieces that didn't fit. The surviving children, Sheila, Rick, and Greg, were left to grow up with the trauma and the unanswered questions. The community of Keddie, already struggling, never fully recovered from the stigma of the crime. The mystery of who killed the Sharp family in Cabin 28 seemed destined to remain unsolved, a testament to a failed investigation and a night of unimaginable rage. But like so many cold cases, the story wasn't over. It was just waiting for a new generation of investigators to pick up the pieces and look at the puzzle with fresh eyes. For nearly 30 years, the Keddie Cabin murders remained frozen in time, a cold case defined by its brutal violence and its frustrating lack of resolution. The initial investigation had been a catastrophe of errors, and the case files gathered dust, filled with conflicting theories and dead-end leads. But the memory of the crime never faded, especially for the surviving family members and a new generation of law enforcement officials who inherited the case. In the 2000s, with the advent of new forensic technologies and a renewed public interest in cold cases fueled by the internet, the Keddie mystery began to see a slow, tentative thaw. The case was taken up by new detectives at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, who were determined to bring a fresh perspective to the old evidence. They began the painstaking process of re-examining every report, re-interviewing witnesses, and, most importantly, looking for physical evidence that might have been overlooked or could now be analyzed with modern techniques. The focus of the new investigation quickly returned to the 2 men who had been dismissed so early on, Marty Smart and his friend, John Bo Bubaid. The more the new investigators looked at them, the more they seemed to be the only logical suspects. A key piece of this renewed focus came from a letter written by Marty Smart himself. Years after the murders, Smart had written a letter to his wife, Marilyn, from whom he was now separated. In the letter, he seemed to all but confess to the crime. He wrote, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through." This letter, which Marilyn had kept for years, was a bombshell. It was not a legal confession, but it was a chilling admission of guilt from the man who had been at the center of the suspicion all along. The investigators also re-interviewed Marilyn Smart. This time, she gave a more detailed and horrifying account of the night of the murders. She claimed that she had left Marty and Bo at a local bar that night because Marty was becoming aggressive. When she returned to her cabin later, she found them there. She said they were acting strangely and were burning something in the wood stove. She also confirmed that Marty had hated John Sharp, viewing him as a rival for Sue's affections and a bad influence. Perhaps the most compelling new witness was a therapist who Marty Smart had seen for counseling. The therapist came forward and told investigators that during their sessions, Smart had confessed to killing Sue Sharp. He claimed that he had not intended to kill anyone else, but that John Sharp and Dana Wingate had walked in on the crime, and he had been forced to kill them as well. He never mentioned killing Tina. This confession, protected by patient confidentiality for years, provided a powerful psychological motive. A crime of passion and rage directed at Sue, which had spiraled into a mass murder. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The new theory of the crime was that Marty Smart and Bo Bubaid had left the bar on the night of April 11th and had gone to cabin 28 to confront Sue Sharp. An argument had escalated into a horrific explosion of violence. They had murdered Sue, and then John and Dana, who had returned home unexpectedly. In the midst of this chaos, they had abducted 12-year-old Tina Sharp, perhaps because she had witnessed the entire event. They had then taken her to a remote location and killed her, returning to their own cabin later to dispose of any evidence. This narrative accounted for almost all of the strange details of the crime. The presence of two killers would explain how 3 people could have been subdued and killed. The personal rage directed at Sue would explain the frenzied nature of the attack. And the abduction of Tina would explain why she was missing while the younger children were left unharmed. The 3 young boys in the other room, Rick, Greg, and Justin Smart, had always been a perplexing part of the mystery. How could they have slept through such a violent and noisy ordeal? It's possible that they were simply children, sleeping the deep sleep of the young, and the small, poorly insulated cabin did little to carry the sounds from one room to the next. But there was another, more chilling possibility. Justin Smart, Marty's son, would later claim, through hypnotic regression therapy, to have witnessed parts of the murder. He described seeing his father and another man with Sue Sharp, and seeing John and Dana fighting with them. He also claimed to have seen Tina being led away by the 2 men. While testimony obtained through hypnosis is not considered reliable in court, it added another layer of suspicion to the case against his father. With this renewed focus on Smart and Bubaid, investigators began to search for physical evidence to connect them to the crime. In 2016, a major search was conducted at a location near the Keddy Resort where Marty Smart had lived after the murders. They recovered a claw hammer from a pond, one that matched the type of weapon believed to have been used in the attacks. The hammer was sent for DNA testing. The results of the new forensic analysis have been slow to emerge and have not yet provided the definitive smoking gun that would close the case. But the circumstantial evidence against Smart and Bubaid has become overwhelming in the eyes of many, including the current investigators. Unfortunately, justice in the legal sense may be impossible. Bo Bubaid died in 1988. Martin Smart died in 2000. They can never be arrested, tried, or convicted. Any resolution to the Keddy case will be a historical one, a matter of closing the books based on the weight of the evidence, rather than a verdict delivered in a courtroom. The legacy of the Keddy cabin murders is a tragic and frustrating one. It is a story of a horrific crime compounded by a failed investigation. The initial catastrophic mishandling of the crime scene created a mystery that was likely unsolvable from day one. It allowed the killers, whoever they were, to walk away, to live out their lives, and to escape justice. It is also a story about the fragility of a fresh start. Sue Sharp had brought her family to Keddy to escape violence and find peace. Instead, they found a different, more explosive kind of darkness waiting for them in the quiet woods. The case serves as a chilling reminder that evil is not confined to cities or to the dark corners of the world. It can exist anywhere, even in a rustic cabin in a sleepy mountain town. The surviving children of the Sharp family have had to live their entire lives in the shadow of this event, haunted by the loss of their mother and siblings and by the lack of answers. Their story is a testament to the long and painful aftermath of violent crime, a trauma that ripples through generations. Today, the town of Keddy is little more than a ghost of what it once was. The resort is closed, the cabins abandoned and decaying. Cabin 28 is gone, demolished in an attempt to erase the physical scar of the crime. But the story remains, a dark legend that is part of the fabric of Northern California. It is a story told by true crime enthusiasts, by local historians, and by the few remaining residents who remember the time when their quiet mountain community became the scene of one of the most brutal and baffling unsolved murders in American history. we are left with a case that feels both solved and unsolved at the same time. The evidence points strongly in one direction, towards two men who are now long dead. But without a legal conclusion, without a definitive piece of DNA evidence that ties it all together, there will always be a small space for doubt, a shadow of uncertainty. The mystery of Cabin 28 is a grim lesson in how justice can be thwarted not by a brilliant criminal mastermind, but by simple human incompetence. The killers were not phantoms. They were neighbors. They were not invisible. They were simply overlooked. The case is a tragedy not just of murder, but of a profound and irreversible failure to see what was right there in front of them. The silence that fell over Keddy in 1981 was not the silence of a perfect crime, but the silence of a botched investigation, a silence that has allowed the ghosts of Cabin 28 to wander, restless and unanswered, for over 40 years. The Chicago Tylenol murders, the mysteries we've explored so far have been intimate ones, crimes defined by a specific place, a cabin, a beach, a lover's lane. The terror, as horrific as it was contained. But there is another kind of crime, one that is not personal but terrifyingly random, a form of violence that doesn't target a single person but an entire society. It's a crime that turns the most mundane and trusted of objects into a potential weapon, and a simple act of relief into a deadly gamble. For our next story, we travel to the sprawling metropolis of Chicago in the fall of 1982. This is the dawn of the modern era of consumer culture, a time of big brands, mass production, and an unspoken trust between the public and the products they brought into their homes. It is here that an unknown killer, armed not with a gun or a knife but with a bottle of cyanide, would unleash a wave of panic that changed the world forever. This is not the story of a hunt for a single killer, but a race against time to stop a silent and invisible poison before it could claim any more lives. This is the story of the Tylenol murders. Our story begins on the morning of Wednesday, September 29, 1982, in the quiet Chicago suburb of Elk Grove Village. A 12-year-old girl named Mary Kellerman woke up with a sore throat and a runny nose. Her parents did what any parent would do. They went to the medicine cabinet and gave her one extra-strength Tylenol capsule. A few minutes later, Mary collapsed on the bathroom floor. She was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead later that morning. The doctors were baffled. A healthy 12-year-old girl does not simply drop dead from a common cold. Her death was a tragic and inexplicable mystery. On the very same day, in the nearby suburb of Arlington Heights, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janis also felt unwell. He stayed home from work and took a Tylenol from a bottle he had just purchased. He collapsed and died shortly after. His family, shocked and grieving, gathered at his home. In their distress, Adam's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley, and Stanley's wife, 19-year-old Teresa, both suffering from headaches brought on by the sudden tragedy, took Tylenol from the very same bottle. Within minutes, Stanley collapsed. A few hours later, Teresa collapsed as well. By the end of the day, 3 members of the same family were dead, all seemingly from natural causes. The string of sudden, unexplained deaths was a statistical anomaly, but no one had yet connected the dots. The victims were in different towns, treated by different doctors. But 2 off-duty firefighters, one from Elk Grove Village and one from Arlington Heights, were talking on the phone that evening. They began comparing notes about the strange deaths in their respective communities. As they talked, they discovered one single terrifying common thread: Tylenol. They immediately notified the authorities. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office began a frantic investigation. They tested the Tylenol capsules from the bottle found in the Janis household. The results were horrifying. The capsules, which should have contained acetaminophen, were instead filled with a lethal dose of potassium cyanide. The red and white gelatin capsules had been carefully pulled apart, the medicine inside replaced with the deadly poison, and then painstakingly put back together. The police now knew they were not dealing with a series of tragic coincidences. This was murder, a new kind of murder, one that was silent, anonymous, and terrifyingly random. An unknown killer, a Tylenol tamperer, was seeding store shelves with poison medicine, turning a trusted household remedy into a weapon of mass destruction. A wave of panic unlike anything the country had ever seen began to spread. Public health officials issued urgent warnings across the Chicago area, telling people not to take any Tylenol products. Police cars drove through neighborhoods, using their loudspeakers to broadcast the warning. Television and radio stations broke into their regular programming with the terrifying news. But the warnings came too late for 3 more victims. Mary Reiner, a 27-year-old new mother in Winfield, Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant in Chicago, and Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old mother of 3 in Elmhurst, all died after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. In the space of just a few days, 7 innocent people were dead. The entire nation was gripped by fear. Tylenol, which had been the #1 most trusted over-the-counter pain reliever in America, became a symbol of a new and insidious kind of terror. People rushed to their medicine cabinets, dumping their bottles of Tylenol down the toilet. Hospitals were flooded with calls from people who had recently taken the medication. The trust that had existed between consumers and the products on their shelves was shattered in an instant. The manufacturer of Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson, was faced with an unprecedented corporate crisis. Their flagship product, a brand they had spent decades building, was now associated with death and poison. In a move that would become a case study in corporate responsibility, Johnson & Johnson made a swift and decisive decision. They immediately issued a massive nationwide recall of every single bottle of Tylenol capsules, over 31 million bottles, at a cost of over $100 million. They offered to replace every recalled bottle with a free, safer, solid tablet form of the product. They put public safety above their own profits, an action that likely saved the brand from complete ruin. While the recall was underway, one of the largest and most complex law enforcement investigations in American history began. A multi-agency task force was formed, including the FBI, the Illinois State Police, and dozens of local police departments. Their mission was twofold: to find every contaminated bottle before it could kill again, and to hunt down the faceless killer who had unleashed this terror. The investigation was a logistical nightmare. The poisoned bottles had been purchased from at least 6 different stores across the Chicago metropolitan area. A drugstore here, a grocery store there. This suggested that the killer had not contaminated the product at the factory or a distribution center. Instead, it appeared they had purchased multiple bottles from various stores, taken them home, laced the capsules with cyanide, and then returned to the stores to secretly place the poisoned bottles back on the shelves. This method was diabolical in its randomness. The killer was not targeting a specific person. They were targeting anyone. Any man, woman, or child who happened to reach for that specific bottle on that specific day could become a victim. The motive was not personal revenge or greed. It seemed to be pure, unadulterated terror. The task force began the painstaking work of trying to build a profile of the killer. They believed they were looking for someone with a deep-seated grudge against Johnson & Johnson or society in general. They were likely intelligent, meticulous, and had some knowledge of chemistry, given their use of potassium cyanide. They were also a coward, a killer who wanted to murder from a distance, without ever having to face their victims. The investigation turned up a few early leads. A surveillance video from one of the stores showed a woman purchasing Tylenol around the time one of the victims had bought their poison bottle. But the image was too grainy to make a positive identification. Another lead focused on a man who had been seen acting suspiciously in one of the drugstores, but he could not be located. Then, about a week into the investigation, a letter arrived at the headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. It was a handwritten extortion note. The author demanded $1 million to stop the killing. The letter was a major breakthrough. It was the first direct communication from someone claiming to be the Tylenol killer. The police now had a motive, extortion, and a piece of physical evidence: the letter itself. The FBI launched a massive effort to trace the letter and identify the author. They set up a complex plan to pay the ransom, hoping to lure the extortionist into a trap. The letter had instructed the company to open a special bank account at a specific Chicago bank. The investigation now had a focus, a name, and a target. It seemed, for a moment, that they were closing in on the Tylenol murderer. The hunt for the author of that letter would lead them down a rabbit hole of false identities, cross-country travel, and a suspect who was as strange and elusive as the crime itself. The city of Chicago, and the entire nation, held its breath, waiting to see if the police could catch the man who had turned their medicine cabinets into a source of terror. The faceless poisoner now had a potential face, and the case was about to take a dramatic and deeply personal turn. But the question remained, was the man who wrote the letter the same man who had filled the capsules with cyanide? Or was this just another layer in a mystery that was becoming more complex by the day? The extortion letter was the break the task force had been desperate for. It provided a tangible focus in a case that had, until then, been terrifyingly abstract. The author of the letter had inadvertently given the investigators a trail to follow. The FBI, working with Johnson & Johnson, set up the bank account as instructed, ready to spring a trap. But the extortionist never attempted to withdraw the money. It seemed the letter was either a bluff or a separate, opportunistic crime committed by someone trying to capitalize on the public panic. The investigation then shifted to the letter itself. Forensic analysis of the handwriting and the envelope led them to a man who had worked at a travel agency in Chicago. And through him, they found their primary suspect, a man named James William Lewis. James Lewis was a strange and shadowy figure. He was a tax accountant with a history of mental health issues and a string of failed businesses. He was intelligent, arrogant, and had a deep-seated grudge against the world. In the 1970s, he had been charged with the brutal murder of a former client in Kansas City, but the case against him had been dismissed on a technicality. He was a man with a dark past, and a mind that seemed to delight in elaborate schemes and manipulations. At the time of the Tylenol murders, Lewis and his wife, Leanne, were living in Chicago under assumed names. When investigators looked into his background, they discovered a disturbing connection. Leanne Lewis had previously worked at a hospital where several of the Tylenol victims had been treated. This seemed, for a moment, like a stunning link. However, it was soon determined to be a coincidence. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt for James and Leanne Lewis. They were eventually tracked down in New York City after a librarian recognized James from a wanted poster and alerted the police. Lewis was arrested, not for the murders but for extortion. During his interrogation, Lewis was cagey and manipulative. He admitted to writing the extortion letter, but he claimed his motive was not to get the money, but to draw attention to the security flaws in his wife's former employer's business practices. It was a bizarre and self-serving explanation. He provided the investigators with detailed diagrams and scenarios of how the Tylenol tamperer could have committed the crime, almost as if he were a consultant on the case. He seemed to revel in the attention and the intellectual cat-and-mouse game he was playing with the FBI. But despite his strange behavior and his connection to the extortion letter, the police could never find any physical evidence to link James Lewis directly to the poisonings. He denied being the killer, and he had an alibi. He and his wife claimed they were in New York at the time of the murders. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no confession. Lewis was convicted of extortion and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he was never charged with the Tylenol murders. He remained the primary suspect, the man who fit the profile and had inserted himself into the case. But the evidence was not there. With Lewis in prison, the investigation went cold once again. But another, even more disturbing suspect emerged years later, a man who had been living in plain sight all along. His name was Roger Arnold. Arnold was a dock worker at a local Jewel grocery store, one of the locations where a poison bottle had been purchased. He was also an amateur chemist who had a personal stash of cyanide in his home. He had a history of mental instability and had told coworkers that he was fascinated with the idea of killing people. The police investigated Arnold in the initial days of the panic, but he was dismissed as a crank. However, in 1983, a year after the murders, Arnold shot and killed a man he mistakenly believed had informed on him to the police about the Tylenol case. He was convicted of this murder and sent to prison, where he died in 2008. Many investigators have come to believe that Roger Arnold was a more likely suspect than James Lewis. He had the means, access to cyanide, the opportunity he worked at one of the stores, and the unstable, violent mindset. But like Lewis, there was no direct evidence to tie him to the poisonings, and he was never charged. The Chicago Tylenol murders remain, to this day, officially unsolved. The case left a legacy of fear, but also one of profound and lasting change. The crime single-handedly ushered in a new era of consumer protection. In its wake, the entire pharmaceutical and food packaging industry was transformed. Tamper-proof packaging, foil seals, plastic wrap, glued boxes became the industry standard. The simple, pull-apart gelatin capsule, which had been so easy for the killer to manipulate, was largely replaced by the solid caplet, and a new federal anti-tampering law was passed, making product tampering a felony. The world we live in today, with its layers of protective seals and safety warnings, was born directly from the terror of 1982. Johnson & Johnson, for its part, is still held up as a model of corporate crisis management. Their swift and total recall of the product, their open and honest communication with the public, and their development of new, safer packaging allowed the Tylenol brand to not only survive, but to eventually regain its position as a trusted household name. But for the families of the 7 victims, Mary Kellerman, Adam, Stanley, and Teresa Janis, Mary Reiner, Paula Prince, and Mary McFarland, there has never been closure. Their loved ones were the victims of a faceless, random act of terror. They were killed not by an enemy, but by an act of trust, by reaching for a familiar remedy in a moment of pain. The case of the Tylenol murders is a chilling study in the nature of modern fear. The killer was not a monster who lurked in the shadows of a dark alley. The monster was the shadow itself, the invisible threat that could be anywhere, in any product, on any shelf. The crime exploited the complex, interconnected systems of modern life, mass production, retail distribution, and consumer trust, and turned them into a weapon. The identity of the Tylenol tamperer will likely never be known for certain. Was it James Lewis, the manipulative extortionist who played games with the FBI? Was it Roger Arnold, the unstable dock worker, with a fascination for poison? Or was it someone else entirely? A person who committed one of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century and then simply faded back into the anonymity of the crowd, their secret never to be told? We are left with a mystery that is both deeply personal in its tragic consequences and terrifyingly impersonal in its execution. The killer didn't know their victims. They didn't see their faces. They simply loaded the dice and placed them on a store shelf, letting fate choose who would live and who would die. The case is a quiet but powerful reminder of the fragility of the systems we rely on every day and the profound trust we place in the anonymous hands that produce and deliver the goods we consume. The Tylenol murders did not just take 7 lives. They took a piece of a nation's innocence, leaving behind a legacy of caution and a faint, lingering whisper of fear in every sealed bottle on every pharmacy shelf. The killer was never caught, but the changes they forced upon the world became their unintended and permanent monument. The case remains a silent testament to a time when a simple headache could be a death sentence, and a trusted household name became, for a brief and terrifying moment, a synonym for poison. The Dyatlov Pass incident, the mysteries we've explored so far, as strange and terrifying as they are, have all been crimes of human hands. They are stories of murder, of motives, of a darkness that, however twisted, is still recognizably human. But for our next journey, we travel to a place so remote, so desolate, and so utterly unforgiving, that the line between human malice and the overwhelming power of nature becomes hopelessly blurred. We go back to the heart of the Cold War Soviet Union, to the snow-blasted, silent slopes of the Ural Mountains. It is here that a group of experienced young hikers would meet an end so bizarre, so violent, and so completely inexplicable that it has become one of the most enduring and debated mysteries of the 20th century. This is not a story of a simple crime scene, but of a scene of pure, high strangeness, a place where the evidence seems to point in a dozen contradictory directions at once. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Our story begins in late January of 1959. A group of 10 students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, all experienced hikers and cross-country skiers, set out on a challenging expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. Their goal was to reach a mountain named Otorten, a journey that would take them through some of the most remote and difficult terrain in the Soviet Union. The group was led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a skilled and respected outdoorsman, and the incident would eventually bear his name. The group was young, athletic, and highly competent. They were all grade 2 hikers, just one step away from the highest certification available, and this trip was meant to earn them their grade 3 classification. They were well equipped for the harsh winter conditions, with skis, warm clothing, and a large, heavy tent designed to withstand the brutal mountain weather. On January 23rd, they began their journey. One member of the group, a man named Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back early due to a flare-up of chronic joint pain. It was a decision that would, unknowingly, save his life. The remaining 9, 7 men and 2 women, pressed on into the wilderness. The group kept detailed diaries and photographs, documenting their journey. The early entries and photos paint a picture of a happy, energetic, and capable team, full of camaraderie and good spirits. They show them skiing through vast, snow-covered forests, setting up camp, and laughing together. There is no hint of any internal conflict or external threat. On February 1st, they began their ascent up the slopes of a mountain known by the indigenous Mansi people as Kolit, which translates ominously to Dead Mountain. They were navigating through a high mountain pass, which would later be named Dyatlov Pass in their honor. The weather was deteriorating, with high winds and falling snow creating near whiteout conditions. Instead of pushing on over the pass to find a more sheltered spot in the forest below, Dyatlov made a strange and ultimately fatal decision. He chose to set up camp on the exposed, open slope of the mountain. This decision has been a source of endless debate among mountaineering experts. It was a direct violation of standard safety protocols. The location offered no protection from the wind and was in a known avalanche-prone area. Why would an experienced leader like Dyatlov choose such a dangerous and illogical spot to pitch their tent? Was it a simple mistake, a miscalculation born of exhaustion and bad weather? Or was there another reason, a threat that made them stop where they were, a danger they perceived that was greater than the mountain itself? Whatever the reason, they pitched their large, heavy tent on the slope of Dead Mountain. They ate a meal, settled in for the night, and prepared to wait out the storm. This was the last time any of them would be seen alive. The group was scheduled to send a telegram to their sports club from a village on the other side of the pass no later than February 12th. When the 12th came and went with no word, there was no immediate alarm. Delays were common on expeditions of this nature. But as the days turned into a week, and there was still no contact, their families began to worry. On February 20th, a volunteer search party, composed of students and teachers from their university, was organized. A few days later, the military and police joined the search, sending in planes and helicopters to scour the vast, empty landscape. On February 26th, a search party discovered the group's abandoned campsite on the slope of Kolit. The scene they found was not just tragic. It was profoundly, bafflingly strange. The tent was half buried in snow, but it was clear that something terrible had happened. It had been sliced open from the inside, not unzipped, not untied, but violently cut open, as if the occupants had been in a desperate, frantic hurry to escape something that was inside the tent with them, or something just outside that was so terrifying they couldn't even take the few seconds required to open the flap. Inside the tent, all of the group's belongings, their shoes, their warm coats, their equipment, their food were left behind, neatly arranged. It was as if they had fled in the middle of the night, in a state of absolute panic, into a blizzard with temperatures well below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, wearing little more than their sleeping clothes. The investigators were faced with a chilling puzzle. What could possibly have terrified 9 experienced, rational hikers so much that they would choose to cut their way out of their only shelter and run, barefoot and underdressed, into a deadly subarctic storm? The search party began to follow the trail of footprints leading away from the tent. The prints, some from bare feet, some from socks, some from a single boot, led downhill, away from the relative safety of the pass and towards the dense forest line. Nearly a mile away, the pattern of the footprints showed no sign of a struggle, no evidence of another group of people. It seemed the 9 hikers had simply walked calmly, side by side, down the slope. This contradicted the violent state of the tent. Why would they flee in a panic, only to walk away in an orderly fashion? At the edge of the forest, under a large, ancient cedar tree, the searchers made their first grim discovery. They found the remains of a small fire, and next to it, the bodies of two of the hikers, Yuri Krivonischenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were both dressed only in their underwear. Their hands and feet were burned, and the branches of the cedar tree above them were broken up to a height of 15 feet, suggesting that one of them had frantically tried to climb the tree. Perhaps they were trying to get a better view of the abandoned tent, or perhaps they were trying to escape something on the ground. About 300 yards from the cedar tree, back in the direction of the tent, the searchers found the body of the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. He was lying on his back in the snow, his hands clenched in a defensive posture, as if he had been trying to shield his face from an attack. Another 300 yards up the slope from Dyatlov, they found the body of Zinaida Kolmogorova, one of the two women in the group. She, too, seemed to have been desperately trying to crawl back up the hill toward the safety of the tent. The positions of their bodies suggested a tragic, final effort to return to the shelter they had so mysteriously fled. It took another 2 months for the remaining 5 hikers to be found. In May, as the snow began to melt, their bodies were discovered buried under more than 10 feet of snow in a ravine, about 75 yards from the cedar tree. These final 4, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov, were dressed more warmly than the others. It appeared that they had taken some of the clothing from their dead comrades at the cedar tree in a desperate attempt to survive. The discovery of these last 4 bodies is where the mystery deepens from a tragic story of hypothermia into something far more sinister and inexplicable. The first 5 hikers who were found had all officially died of hypothermia. They had frozen to death. But the final 4 had suffered horrific, violent injuries. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles had a massive, fatal skull fracture. Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had crushed chests, their ribs shattered with a force that the medical examiner compared to the impact of a car crash. And most bizarrely, Ludmila was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lips. The medical examiner was baffled. These were not injuries that could have been caused by a simple fall or by exposure to the elements. They were the result of an immense, crushing force. And yet, there were no external wounds, no soft tissue damage, no bruising consistent with a human attack. It was as if they had been squeezed by some incredible, inhuman power, adding another layer of high strangeness to the case. Some of the victims' clothing was found to be radioactive, not dangerously so, but with levels of radiation that were significantly higher than normal background levels. The Soviet authorities launched a full investigation, but their official conclusion was as unsatisfying as it was vague. The final report stated that the 9 hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force. The case was then abruptly closed, the files classified and sealed away for decades, and public access to the Dyatlov Pass region was forbidden for 3 years. This official silence, this refusal to provide a clear explanation, only fueled a storm of speculation that has lasted to this day. What was this compelling natural force? And what could possibly explain the bizarre and contradictory evidence left behind at the scene? A tent cut from the inside, a calm walk into a blizzard, unexplained, massive internal injuries, missing body parts, and radioactive clothing. The Dyatlov Pass incident is not a simple whodunit. It is a puzzle box of mysteries, each one leading to another, stranger question. The theories that have emerged over the years range from the rational and scientific to the deeply paranormal and conspiratorial. Each one attempts to create a single, coherent narrative that can account for all the bizarre and terrifying details of that night on Dead Mountain. But as we will see, every logical explanation seems to fall short, leaving the door open to possibilities that stretch the very limits of our understanding. The story of what happened to the Dyatlov hikers was not just a tragedy. It was the beginning of one of the most profound and unsettling enigmas of the 20th century. The official conclusion of a compelling natural force was a bureaucratic shrug, an answer that answered nothing. It was a phrase that seemed designed to end the conversation, but instead, it ignited a firestorm of speculation that has burned for over 60 years. The bizarre and contradictory evidence left on the slopes of Dead Mountain became a fertile ground for theories, each one trying to weave the strange clues into a coherent narrative. These theories can be broadly grouped into three categories: the rational, the conspiratorial, and the paranormal. The most widely accepted rational explanation, and the one most favored by modern investigators, centers on a rare and terrifying natural phenomenon: an avalanche. Not a massive, sweeping slab avalanche that would have buried the tent completely, but a smaller, more localized slab avalanche. In this scenario, a slab of heavy, compacted snow on the slope above the tent suddenly fractured and slid down, not burying the hikers, but crushing the front of their tent with an immense, sudden force. This would explain the violent urgency to escape. Trapped in the dark, with the weight of tons of snow pressing down on them, the hikers would have had no choice but to cut their way out from the inside. It would also explain the massive, crushing chest and skull injuries found on the last 4 victims. They may have been caught directly under the initial impact of the snow slab, their bones shattered by the immense pressure, while the others, sleeping further back in the tent, were spared the direct trauma, fleeing into the night, disoriented, underdressed, and some of them severely injured. They would have made their way to the relative shelter of the forest line. The orderly pattern of their footprints could be explained by their training. Even in a panic, experienced hikers might stick together, walking in single file to conserve energy. Once at the tree line, a tragic drama of survival would have played out. The 2 men found by the cedar tree, Yuri Krivonischenko and Yuri Doroshenko, likely died first from hypothermia while trying desperately to start a fire. The broken branches on the tree above them could have been their attempt to gather kindling, or perhaps an effort to climb the tree to get a better look at the campsite, to see if the avalanche danger had passed. The other 3 found on the slope, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, who was later found to have a skull fracture, were likely trying to make their way back to the tent, a desperate, final attempt to retrieve their gear, only to succumb to the freezing temperatures. The final 4, including those with the most severe injuries, likely survived the longest. They had made a small snow den in the ravine for shelter and had taken the clothing from their fallen comrades. But their injuries were too severe, the conditions too brutal. They, too, eventually succumbed. The missing tongue of Ludmila Dubinina, one of the most ghoulish details of the case, could be explained by natural decomposition and scavenging animals. The ravine where her body was found would have been filled with meltwater in the spring, and small scavengers are known to target soft tissues. This avalanche theory is neat, scientific, and accounts for many of the key pieces of evidence. It is currently the most favored explanation among Russian investigators who reopened the case in 2019. However, it is not without its own problems. The slope where the tent was pitched was not particularly steep, less than 30 degrees, which is generally not considered a high-risk angle for an avalanche. The investigators at the time found no evidence of a recent avalanche, and the hikers' own tracks leading away from the tent were not covered by any subsequent snowfall, which seems unlikely if a slab of snow had just come crashing down. The second category of theories ventures into the realm of military conspiracy. This was the height of the Cold War, and the Ural Mountains were a site of significant Soviet military and industrial activity, including secret weapons testing. This theory suggests that the hikers accidentally stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see. A secret military test, perhaps of a new type of parachute mine, a concussion weapon, or even a radiological dirty bomb. In this scenario, a military weapon test gone wrong could explain the hikers' sudden flight and the strange injuries. A concussion blast from an airbursting weapon could produce the massive internal trauma without leaving external wounds. The presence of low-level radiation on some of the victims' clothing could also be explained by exposure to a secret radiological weapon. The strange orbs or spheres of light that were reported in the sky by other witnesses in the region around the same time could have been part of this military activity. The government's swift and secretive handling of the case, the classified files, the vague conclusion, the closing of the area, all lend credence to this theory. It would explain why the authorities were so keen to shut down the investigation. They were not just covering up a tragic accident. They were covering up a state secret. The compelling natural force was a euphemism for a man-made one. This theory is compelling in its narrative power, but it lacks any direct evidence. It is a story built on the known secrecy and paranoia of the Soviet state, but it remains in the realm of speculation. The third and most exotic category of theories involves the paranormal. This is where the story of Dyatlov Pass truly enters the realm of high strangeness. These theories attempt to explain the elements of the case that science and logic struggle with. One popular paranormal theory is that the hikers were attacked by an unknown creature, a Russian Yeti or Menk. The massive, crushing injuries and the fear that drove the hikers from their tent could, in this view, be the work of a powerful, inhuman entity. The local Mansi people have legends of wild men who inhabit the mountains, and some have pointed to these stories as evidence. Another theory points to extraterrestrial involvement. The strange lights in the sky reported by others have been interpreted by some as UFOs. Was the group attacked or frightened by an alien presence? This theory is, of course, the most speculative and lacks any evidence, but it persists because it offers an explanation for the sheer, baffling weirdness of the entire event. Then there is the infrasound theory. This scientific, yet strange, theory proposes that a specific weather phenomenon, known as a Kármán vortex street, could have created a low-frequency infrasound in the pass. Infrasound is sound below the level of human hearing, but it can have profound physiological and psychological effects, including feelings of intense, irrational fear, panic, and nausea. In this scenario, the hikers were not driven from their tent by a physical threat, but by an invisible wave of sound that triggered a primal, uncontrollable panic. This would explain their sudden, irrational flight, but it does not account for the violent physical injuries. The legacy of the Dyatlov Pass incident is that of a perfect mystery. It is a case where every plausible explanation has its own fatal flaw, and every strange clue seems to contradict another. It is a story that operates on the very edge of our understanding, a place where the lines between science, conspiracy, and the supernatural become impossibly blurred. The 9 young people who died on that mountain: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Krivonischenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and Semyon Zolotaryov were not just victims. They have become figures of legend. They were capable, intelligent, and brave young people who were confronted with something so terrifying and so powerful that it overwhelmed all of their experience and training. Their story is a chilling reminder of the vast, unknowable power of the wilderness, and perhaps of forces that we do not yet understand. It is a testament to the fact that even in our modern, scientific world, there are still places and events that defy easy explanation, mysteries that resist being solved. Today, the Dyatlov Pass is a place of pilgrimage for adventurers and mystery enthusiasts from around the world. A memorial stands there, a simple, stark monument to the 9 lives that were lost. But the pass itself holds the real memorial, the silence. It is a silence filled with unanswered questions. What was the compelling natural force? Was it a rare type of avalanche? A secret military weapon? Or something else, something stranger? Something that came out of the darkness of that Siberian night and left behind a scene of perfect, incomprehensible horror? We will likely never know for certain. The witnesses are gone. The evidence is frozen in time. The mystery of Dyatlov Pass endures not because we are close to an answer, but because we are so profoundly, hopelessly far from one. It is a story that forces us to confront the limits of our own knowledge and to accept that some questions may be destined to echo forever, unanswered, in the cold, silent wind of the Ural Mountains. The unsolved hijacking of Flight 648, the mystery of Dyatlov Pass, was a story of an incomprehensible force meeting a group of people in the vast, empty wilderness. It was a puzzle of physical evidence that defied logic. But there is another kind of terror, one that unfolds not on a desolate mountain slope, but in a pressurized cabin, 30,000 feet in the air. It's a story not about what happened in the wild, but about what happens when the fragile order of civilization is breached in one of its most vulnerable spaces. For our final story, we travel to the turbulent skies of the Mediterranean in the mid-1980s. This was an era of intense geopolitical conflict, a time of state-sponsored terrorism, hijackings, and a world that felt increasingly on edge. It is here that a routine flight would descend into a 24-hour nightmare of violence, negotiation, and chaos, culminating in a disastrous rescue attempt that would leave dozens dead and raise profound questions about the price of fighting terror. This is not a story of a quiet vanishing, but of a loud, bloody, and tragic spectacle that played out on the world stage. This is the story of Egypt Air Flight 648. Our story begins on the evening of November 23, 1985. Egypt Air Flight 648, an Airbus A320, was on a routine flight from Athens, Greece to Cairo, Egypt. On board were 92 passengers and a crew of 6. The passengers were a diverse group, a cross-section of the globe. Egyptians, Greeks, Filipinos, Australians, Mexicans, and Americans. They were tourists heading home, business travelers, families. For them, this was just another flight, a few hours in the air before landing in the bustling capital of Egypt. About 10 minutes after takeoff, as the plane climbed to its cruising altitude over the dark Mediterranean Sea, the calm was shattered. 3 men, who had been sitting among the passengers, suddenly stood up. They were armed with guns and grenades. They were members of a radical Palestinian militant group, the Abu Nidal organization, one of the most feared and ruthless terrorist factions of the era. The hijacking had begun. The lead hijacker, a man named Omar Razak, was a seasoned and cold-blooded operative. He and his accomplices began to systematically take control of the aircraft. They collected the passports of all the passengers, identifying them by nationality. This was a chilling and ominous act. It meant they were not just hijacking a plane. They were sorting their hostages. In the front of the plane, an Egyptian security guard who was on board, a sky marshal, saw what was happening and decided to act. He pulled out his own firearm and opened fire on the hijackers. A chaotic, terrifying gun battle erupted in the narrow confines of the passenger cabin. The sky marshal managed to kill one of the hijackers, but he himself was severely wounded. The plane's fuselage was punctured by stray bullets, causing a rapid depressurization of the cabin. The pilots were forced to make an emergency descent, dropping the plane to a lower altitude where the air was breathable. In the chaos of the gunfight, dozens of passengers were also injured by shrapnel and stray bullets. The dream of a peaceful flight had turned into a scene of smoke, fear, and bloodshed. With the plane damaged and losing fuel, the hijackers knew they could not reach their intended destination of Libya. They needed to land, and land quickly. They ordered the pilot to fly to the island nation of Malta, a small, historically neutral country in the middle of the Mediterranean. The Maltese government, led by Prime Minister Karmenu Mifsud Benisi, was now faced with an international crisis. A hijacked plane, full of international passengers and controlled by heavily armed terrorists, was demanding to land at their airport. The Maltese authorities initially refused permission, turning off the runway lights and blocking the tarmac. But the hijackers were adamant. The plane was low on fuel and had been damaged in the gunfight. If they were not allowed to land, they would crash into the sea. Reluctantly, the Maltese government acquiesced. At around 11 p.m., Egypt Air Flight 648 touched down at Lucca Airport in Malta. The plane taxied to a remote corner of the airfield and was immediately surrounded by Maltese security forces. The stage was set for a long, tense, and ultimately tragic standoff. The negotiations began almost immediately. The hijackers, led by Omar Razak, made their demands clear. They wanted the plane to be refueled so they could continue their journey. They also began a grim and terrifying process of psychological warfare. They started with the wounded, releasing 2 injured flight attendants and a handful of Filipino women. But this was not an act of mercy. It was a tactic. Razak then announced that if his demands for fuel were not met, he would begin executing passengers, one every 15 minutes. To prove he was serious, he selected his first victim. Her name was Tamar Artzi, an Israeli woman. He took her to the front of the plane to the open door. He shot her in the head and then again in the back, and pushed her body out onto the tarmac. Miraculously, Tamar Artzi survived her injuries, but the message was clear. The hijackers were not bluffing. Over the next several hours, this horrifying ritual continued. Razak would select a hostage, usually an Israeli or an American, take them to the door and shoot them. He shot and killed 2 more women Nitzen Mendelsohn and Scarlett Marie Rogenkamp, an American Air Force employee. Their bodies were pushed from the plane onto the cold tarmac below. Inside the plane, the remaining passengers were living through a nightmare of unimaginable terror, waiting to see who would be chosen next. The negotiations were at a stalemate. The Maltese government, adhering to its policy of not giving in to terrorist demands, refused to provide fuel. They offered food and medical supplies, but the hijackers refused. The situation was becoming more desperate by the hour. The Egyptian government, meanwhile, was not content to sit by and let a neutral third party handle the crisis. Egypt, under President Hosni Mubarak, had a close relationship with the United States and was a key player in Middle Eastern politics. They had their own elite U.S.-trained counterterrorism force, known as Unit 777. The Egyptians insisted that they were the only ones equipped to handle the situation. They dispatched a team of commandos to Malta, along with American advisors, ready to storm the plane. The Maltese government was deeply reluctant to allow a foreign military force to operate on their soil. They were a small, neutral nation, and they feared that a violent rescue attempt would lead to a bloodbath and drag them into a larger international conflict. For hours, a tense diplomatic standoff unfolded, a negotiation between Egypt and Malta happening in parallel to the negotiation with the hijackers. But as the hijackers continued their brutal executions, the pressure to act became unbearable. The world was watching. The lives of dozens of innocent people were hanging in the balance. Finally, late on the night of November 24th, after nearly 24 hours of terror, the Maltese government gave its reluctant approval. The Egyptian commandos of Unit 777 were given the green light to storm the plane. The plan for the rescue was a complex and high-risk one. The commandos would approach the plane under the cover of darkness. They would place explosive charges on the main cabin doors and the cargo bay doors. The explosions would breach the aircraft, and the commandos would storm in, neutralizing the hijackers and freeing the hostages. It was a standard counterterrorism assault plan, the kind of thing that is practiced in training but is incredibly difficult and dangerous to execute in a real-world, high-stress situation. Inside the plane, the remaining hostages were huddled together, terrified but also sensing that something was about to happen. The hijackers were growing more agitated, more paranoid. Omar Razak was still in control, but the situation was becoming increasingly unstable. At around 2 a.m. on November 25th, the night sky over Lucca Airport was suddenly illuminated by a series of massive explosions. The Egyptian commandos had begun their assault, but from the very first moment, the raid went catastrophically, tragically wrong. The explosive charges they used were far too powerful. Instead of just blowing open the doors, they ripped huge, gaping holes in the fuselage of the aircraft. The explosion ignited the plane's cabin, which was filled with flammable materials. A massive fire erupted, and the cabin was instantly filled with thick, black, suffocating smoke. The commandos, wearing dark uniforms and gas masks, stormed into the burning, smoke-filled chaos. The passengers, already terrified, were now caught in a disorienting hellscape of fire, smoke, and shouting. They couldn't tell the difference between the commandos and the hijackers. Many of them believed the commandos were a new group of terrorists, there to kill them all. The hijackers, in the confusion, began to fight back. Omar Razak started throwing his grenades into the passenger cabin. He also began shooting indiscriminately at the passengers, trying to kill as many as he could before he was taken down. The Egyptian commandos, unable to see clearly in the smoke, also began firing wildly, their bullets tearing through the cabin, hitting both hijackers and hostages alike. The assault, which was meant to be a swift and precise rescue mission, had descended into a chaotic and deadly firefight inside a burning airplane. The passengers were trapped in a crossfire, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The dream of a dramatic rescue had become a new and even more terrifying nightmare. The story of Flight 648 was about to reach its horrific, bloody, and deeply controversial conclusion. A conclusion that would leave a legacy of death, unanswered questions, and a hard lesson. The assault on Egypt Air Flight 648, which was intended to be a decisive and life-saving rescue, had instantly devolved into a chaotic inferno. The overly powerful explosives used by the Egyptian commandos had not just breached the doors. They had ripped a huge hole in the plane's roof and ignited a flash fire that swept through the cabin. Thick, toxic smoke from the burning plastic and upholstery filled the aircraft, creating a scene of complete and utter pandemonium. The surviving passengers, who had already endured nearly 24 hours of terror, were now caught in a disorienting hell. They couldn't see, they couldn't breathe, and they couldn't distinguish friend from foe. The Egyptian commandos, clad in black and wearing gas masks, looked just as terrifying as the hijackers. In the smoke and confusion, panicked passengers scrambled over seats and each other, desperate to find a way out of the burning, smoke-filled tube. The hijackers, led by the sole surviving original member, Omar Razak, fought back with ferocious desperation. Razak began throwing his grenades into the crowded passenger cabin and firing his weapon at anyone who moved. The Egyptian commandos returned fire, their bullets tearing through the thin walls of the aircraft and, tragically, through the bodies of the hostages they were there to save. The assault was no longer a rescue. It was a close-quarters battle being fought in the middle of a crowd of innocent, terrified civilians. For several long, agonizing minutes, the cabin of Flight 648 was a whirlwind of explosions, gunfire, and screams. Passengers were killed by the hijackers' grenades, by the commandos' bullets, and by the fire and smoke inhalation. It was a complete and catastrophic failure of a rescue mission, a textbook example of how a poorly planned and executed assault can be more deadly than the hostage situation itself. When the chaos finally subsided, and the fire was brought under control, the true cost of the botched raid was revealed. Of the 91 passengers and crew on board at the time of the assault, 58 were dead. Only about a third of the people on the plane had survived. Some had died in the initial firefight and explosions. Others had succumbed to the fire and smoke. The tarmac at Lucca Airport, which had been the scene of a tense standoff, was now the scene of a mass casualty event. The lead hijacker, Omar Razak, was wounded in the assault but had survived. In the confusion, he managed to strip off his identifying gear and mingle with the injured passengers being taken to the hospital. He was just another victim, another face in the chaos. The Egyptian commandos, for their part, believed they had killed all the hijackers. The aftermath of the raid was a firestorm of international controversy and condemnation. The Egyptian government hailed the assault as a success, claiming their brave commandos had fought a heroic battle against terrorism. But the rest of the world saw it for what it was: a disaster. The high death toll, the use of excessive force, and the lack of a clear, coordinated plan were heavily criticized. The Maltese government, which had reluctantly approved the raid, was also blamed for allowing it to happen. The incident exposed a deep and troubling divide in how different nations approached the growing threat of international terrorism. The Egyptians, with their aggressive, military-first approach, had clashed with the Maltese preference for negotiation and caution. The result was a tragic compromise that had maximized the loss of life. The story of the survivors was one of incredible resilience and profound trauma. They had lived through a hijacking, a series of executions, and a bloody, fiery assault. Many were left with lifelong physical and psychological scars. Their accounts painted a terrifying picture of the chaos inside the cabin, a story that stood in stark contrast to the heroic narrative being pushed by the Egyptian government. And what of Omar Razak, the man at the center of it all? For a time, it seemed he might actually get away. He was treated for his injuries in a Maltese hospital, his true identity unknown. But U.S. intelligence, including the FBI and the State Department, was working behind the scenes. They had identified him from survivor accounts and intelligence sources. They pressured the Maltese authorities, who eventually arrested him. Razak was tried in Malta, but not for murder. He was convicted of lesser charges related to the hijacking and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In a decision that outraged the international community, particularly the United States and Israel, he was released on parole after serving only 7 years. He was a free man, but the United States had not forgotten him. The murder of Scarlett Rogenkamp, an American citizen, on that tarmac gave the U.S. jurisdiction. the FBI launched a covert operation to bring him to justice. In 1993, they learned that Razak was traveling to Nigeria. In a complex and daring international operation, U.S. agents, working with Nigerian authorities, essentially kidnapped him, forcing him onto a plane bound for the United States. He was arrested the moment he landed on American soil. Omar Razak was finally put on trial in a U.S. federal court in Washington, D.C. He was charged with air piracy. In 1996, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Justice, after a long and circuitous journey, was finally served, at least for the man who led the hijacking. The legacy of the Egypt Air Flight 648 hijacking is a dark and cautionary one. It stands as one of the deadliest and most botched rescue attempts in aviation history. It became a textbook case for counterterrorism experts on how not to conduct a hostage rescue. The incident led to major reviews of counterterrorism tactics around the world and highlighted the critical importance of negotiation, intelligence, and coordination between different countries. But for the families of the victims, the legacy is one of profound and senseless loss. Their loved ones were not just killed by terrorists. They were killed in the crossfire of a flawed and chaotic response. They were victims of the hijacking, and they were victims of the rescue. The story of Flight 648 is a grim reminder of the brutal realities of the fight against terrorism in the 1980s. It was an era of learning, an era of terrible trial and error. The methods were often blunt, the consequences often tragic. The incident stripped away any romantic notions of heroic, flawless commando raids and exposed the messy, bloody, and often catastrophic reality of real-world counterterrorism operations. Today, the event is largely a footnote in the long history of international terrorism. But for those who were on that plane, for the families who lost loved ones, and for the investigators and officials who lived through that 24-hour nightmare, the memory remains vivid. It is a memory of a routine flight that descended into hell, of a series of cold-blooded executions on a dark tarmac, and of a fiery, chaotic rescue that saved some but doomed so many others. The story ends not with a clean resolution, but with a somber accounting of the cost. It is a testament to the fact that in the fight against a great evil, sometimes the lines between right and wrong, between rescue and disaster, can become terribly and tragically blurred. The fire on Flight 648 was eventually extinguished, but the questions it raised about the price of justice continue to smolder.